I thought my morning walks were just another part of my routine, until a quiet 55-year-old neighbor smiled at me. I never imagined that one invitation to dinner would force me to choose between the life I knew and the feelings I never expected. This is the story of how one lonely neighbor changed everything. The first time I noticed Jimmy Anderson, I honestly didn't think much of it. Every morning at exactly 6:15, my alarm would buzz inside my apartment in Portland, Oregon. Most people my age hated mornings, but I loved them. There was something about watching the city wake up that made me feel alive. The streets were quiet, the air smelled like fresh pine after the night's rain, and the sunrise painted the sky with shades of orange and gold. My name is Alex. I'm 24 years old, and fitness has always been a huge part of my life. I work remotely as a graphic designer, which means I spend most of my day sitting behind a computer. My morning walk wasn't just exercise, it was my way of clearing my mind before work. Every day I followed the same route through Washington Park. And every day, without fail, there was one man already there. He looked to be in his mid-50s, tall with silver hair, broad shoulders, and a calm confidence that made him stand out without trying. He always wore the same navy running jacket, carried a reusable coffee cup, and greeted everyone with the same warm smile. Morning. That was all he'd say. Simple, friendly, nothing more. For nearly 2 weeks, that was the extent of our relationship. Just two strangers sharing the same sidewalk every sunrise. One chilly Monday morning, as I stretched near the trail entrance, he walked over. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Sure," I replied with a smile. "I'm Jimmy." "Alex." We shook hands before continuing down the trail together. It started with small talk. The weather, the trailblazers, coffee, traffic, nothing personal. But Jimmy had this relaxed way of talking that made every conversation feel effortless. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it actually meant something. "So," he asked, "what gets a guy your age out of bed before sunrise?" I laughed. "Honestly, I hate crowded gyms." He chuckled. "That's probably the smartest answer I've heard all week." That morning's walk ended much faster than usual. Before leaving, Jimmy pointed toward a small coffee shop across the street. "They make the best espresso in Portland. I've never tried it." "Tomorrow," he said with a grin. "Coffee's on me." I almost said no. Instead, "I'll be here." The next morning we sat outside the little cafe while the city slowly came to life around us. Jimmy insisted on paying. "I invited you," he said. "You don't have to keep buying my coffee." "I know. So why do it?" He smiled. "Because good conversations deserve good coffee." That became our routine. Walk, coffee, talk, day after day, week after week. I learned Jimmy Anderson was 55 years old and had spent nearly 3 decades designing homes throughout Oregon before retiring early. He loved woodworking, classic jazz, old bookstores, and spending weekends restoring antique furniture. He never bragged about his accomplishments. In fact, I only found out he designed some of Portland's most beautiful homes because another customer at the cafe recognized him. "You built my parents' house," the man said excitedly. Jimmy simply smiled. "I'm glad they're still enjoying it." That humility impressed me. Most successful people wanted everyone to know how important they were. Jimmy wasn't like that. When he asked questions, he genuinely cared about the answers. He remembered little things. My favorite coffee order. The fact that my mom called every Sunday. That I hated mushrooms. That I'd recently started learning photography. It was strange how someone I'd only known a few weeks already seemed to know me better than some friends I'd had for years. One morning, while we watched ducks glide across the lake, Jimmy asked, "So, where do you see yourself in 10 years?" I shrugged. "I don't know. No dream house. Maybe. No family. I've never really thought that far." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. "When I was 24, I thought I had my entire life planned." "What happened?" He smiled at the water. "Life happened." He didn't explain further. Somehow that answer felt heavier than any long story could have been. As the weeks passed, our conversations became longer. We laughed about embarrassing stories, debated movies, argued over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He teased me whenever I ordered sugary drinks. "You call that coffee? I call it happiness." He laughed so hard people at nearby tables turned around. For reasons I couldn't explain, I looked forward to those mornings more than anything else. Not because of the exercise, because of Jimmy. Then one Tuesday, everything changed. I arrived at the park at exactly 6:20. The familiar bench was empty. No navy jacket. No silver hair. No warm smile. I checked my phone. Nothing. I waited another 15 minutes. Still nothing. For the first time in weeks, I walked alone. The trail suddenly felt longer, quieter, almost empty. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to hear Jimmy call my name. He never did. By lunchtime, I found myself wondering if he was sick. By afternoon, I wondered if he'd simply decided to change his routine. By evening, I caught myself looking out my apartment window toward his house across the street. I frowned. Why was I so worried? We'd only known each other for a little over a month. Yet the thought of never seeing him again left a strange ache in my chest that I couldn't explain. Just as the sun disappeared behind the trees, someone knocked on my front door. I opened it, and there stood Jimmy Anderson holding 2 cups of coffee with an apologetic smile on his face. "I'm sorry I missed our walk this morning," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" For a second, I simply stared at him. The worry I'd been carrying around all day disappeared the moment I saw that familiar smile. "You had me thinking something terrible happened," I admitted. Jimmy let out a quiet laugh, though I noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sorry about that." He handed me one of the coffees. "My peace offering." I stepped aside. "Come in." We sat on my small balcony overlooking the quiet neighborhood. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh rain, and for a while we drank our coffee without saying much. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me all day. "So, where were you this morning?" Jimmy looked down at his cup. "I had a doctor's appointment." The words instantly made me nervous. "Is everything okay?" He smiled reassuringly. "Nothing serious. Just one of those reminders that I'm not 25 anymore." I laughed with relief. "Don't scare me like that again." His eyes met mine for a brief moment. "I didn't realize someone would actually miss me," I answered before thinking. "Of course I would." The words hung in the air between us. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Jimmy finally cleared his throat. "Actually, there's another reason I stopped by." "What is it?" "I was wondering if you'd have dinner with me tomorrow night." I blinked. "Dinner? At my place?" I smiled politely. "I appreciate it, Jimmy. But you really don't have to go through all that trouble." "It's not trouble. I'm sure you're busy. I already bought the groceries." I laughed. "You're making it hard to say no." "That was the plan." I shook my head with a grin. "You're persistent." "I've been told that before." After another few seconds, I finally nodded. "Okay." His face immediately brightened. "Really?" "Yeah." 7 o'clock? "I'll be there." As he walked back across the street toward his house, I couldn't help smiling. It was just dinner. Nothing more. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. The next evening I stood in front of my closet much longer than I wanted to admit. I changed shirts twice, then a third time. Finally, I settled on a fitted navy button-up with dark jeans. When I looked in the mirror, I laughed at myself. "It's dinner with your neighbor, Alex. So why are you nervous?" At exactly 7 o'clock, I walked across the street and knocked on Jimmy's front door. A few seconds later, he opened it with the same warm smile I'd grown used to every morning. "You actually came." I said I would.
I'm glad.
The house was beautiful. Warm wooden floors, large windows overlooking the backyard. Bookshelves filled every wall. Framed photographs covered the hallway, each one telling a different chapter of someone's life. "It smells amazing," I said. Jimmy chuckled. "I spent most of the afternoon making sure I didn't burn dinner." "You cook." "I've had a lot of years to practice." He led me into the dining room where a homemade dinner was already waiting. Grilled steak, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a simple salad. You made all this? I had help. Who? The internet. I laughed. I don't believe that. Dinner felt surprisingly comfortable. There was no awkward silence. No pressure. Just two people sharing a meal and talking about life. Jimmy asked about my childhood. I told him about growing up in Oregon, my first terrible apartment, and how I accidentally dyed all my white clothes pink during college. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his fork. I wish I'd known you back then. I probably would have asked you to fix my washing machine. I would have. That answer made me smile. After dinner, Jimmy disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying 2 slices of homemade apple pie. Please don't tell me you baked this too. I did. What can't you do? He thought for a second. Sing. I need proof. You absolutely do not. We both laughed. As the evening grew quieter, my eyes wandered toward the family photographs sitting on a nearby shelf. One picture showed a younger Jimmy standing beside a smiling woman. Another showed a teenage boy holding a baseball trophy. You have a beautiful family, I said softly. Jimmy's smile became gentler. Ido. He picked up one of the frames. This was my wife, Emily. I studied the photo. You both look really happy. We were. His voice was calm, but there was sadness behind it. What happened? She passed away almost 8 years ago. I'm so sorry. He nodded quietly. Life has a way of changing everything when you least expect it. He placed the photograph back on the shelf. And this? I pointed toward the young man in another picture. My son, Ethan. He looks a lot like you. Thankfully, he got his mother's patience instead. We both smiled. Where is he now? He lives in Boston. Really? He married a wonderful woman a few years ago. They're building a life together there. You must miss him. Every single day. His eyes slowly drifted around the quiet house. It used to be so loud in here. He smiled sadly. Now it's usually just me. The room suddenly felt much larger than before. For the first time, I noticed how quiet the house really was. No television. No footsteps upstairs. No voices. Just the ticking of an old clock hanging on the wall. Jimmy looked around for a moment before speaking again. You know what's strange? What? I don't really miss being young anymore. I stayed quiet. He looked directly at me. I miss having someone to come home to. His words landed harder than I expected. There wasn't self-pity in his voice. Just honesty. The kind that only comes from years of carrying loneliness in silence. I didn't know what to say, so I simply listened. Sometimes that's what people need the most. Jimmy smiled softly. Sorry. For what? I didn't invite you over to unload all of this. You don't have to apologize. I'm usually better at hiding it. You don't have to hide anything from me. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jimmy took a slow breath. There is something else I've wanted to tell you. I looked at him curiously. What is it? He hesitated for several long seconds, as if deciding whether to say the words out loud. Finally, he looked me straight in the eyes. Alex, can I tell you something I've never told anyone before? The expression on his face told me whatever came next was about to change everything between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. The question lingered between us, filling the silence in a way that made my heart beat faster. I nodded. You can tell me anything. Jimmy took a slow breath before looking out the living room window. The last light of the evening had disappeared, leaving only the warm glow of the lamps inside the house. I've replayed this conversation in my head 100 times, he admitted, and every version ended with me saying nothing. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to risk losing our friendship. His words immediately caught my attention. Alex, over the last few months, you've become the best part of my day. He gave a small, nervous laugh. I look forward to every sunrise because I know I'll probably see you. I could hear the emotion in his voice. I know there's an age difference. I know our lives are completely different. And I know you never gave me a reason to expect anything. He paused. But somewhere along the way, I realized my feelings for you became more than friendship. The room fell completely silent. Jimmy quickly looked away. I'm not asking you for anything, he said softly. I'm not expecting an answer tonight. I just couldn't keep pretending anymore. I respect you too much to hide the truth. For several seconds, I couldn't find a single word. Not because I was angry, because I was surprised. I had never imagined this conversation. Jimmy stood up. I think you should go home. I looked at him. I don't want this to become uncomfortable. He forced a smile. I'd rather keep you as a friend than lose you completely. I slowly stood. Before leaving, I placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for trusting me. He nodded, but I could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. That night I barely slept. His words kept replaying in my mind. I told myself I was only confused. Jimmy was my friend, someone I respected, someone I genuinely cared about. But was that all it was? The next morning my alarm rang at 6:15 like always. I turned it off and stayed in bed. I couldn't bring myself to go to the park. Not because I wanted to avoid Jimmy, but because I didn't know how to face him. One day turned into 2, then 3. Jimmy never called. He never texted. At first I wondered why. Then I realized exactly why. He was giving me space. He wasn't trying to pressure me into making a decision. That realization somehow made me respect him even more. Still, something felt wrong. My mornings became strangely empty. I walked alone once, but the familiar trail no longer felt the same. The coffee shop seemed quieter. The conversations I used to look forward to had disappeared. Even the barista smiled sadly when she saw me. No Jimmy today? I shook my head. I don't think so. She frowned. You two were becoming regulars. I smiled politely, but inside I felt a strange ache. That evening I found myself standing outside my apartment, staring across the street at Jimmy's porch. His lights were off. The house looked darker than usual. For the first time, I realized how much space he'd quietly filled in my life. A few days later, while checking my mailbox, I ran into Mrs. Harper, an elderly neighbor who had lived on our street for years. She smiled warmly. Have you heard about Jimmy? My stomach tightened. What happened? Oh, nothing bad. She adjusted the letters in her hand. He told me he's moving. The words hit me harder than I expected. Moving? She nodded. Closer to his son. I think somewhere near Boston. When? I believe next week. Next week. I thanked her and walked back inside, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. Jimmy was leaving. Leaving Portland. Leaving our morning walks. Leaving our coffee shop. Leaving me. I sat on my couch for hours, trying to convince myself that it shouldn't matter. People moved all the time. Friends drifted apart. Life went on. So why did my chest feel so heavy? Late that night, I opened my phone and scrolled through our old messages. Most of them were simple. See you at 6. Coffee tomorrow? Don't forget your camera. I smiled without realizing it. Somewhere between those ordinary conversations, Jimmy had become part of my everyday life, and I hadn't noticed until I was about to lose him. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on a hoodie, crossed the street, and hurried toward his front door. Before I could knock, I noticed the garage door standing open. Inside were stacks of moving boxes. Furniture was wrapped in protective blankets. Bookshelves were empty. Family photographs had been carefully packed away. Jimmy stood in the middle of the garage, sealing another cardboard box with packing tape. He looked up. For a brief second, surprise crossed his face. Then he smiled gently. I wasn't expecting to see you. I looked around at everything packed into boxes. You're really leaving? Jimmy nodded quietly. I thought it was the right thing to do. Standing there, surrounded by the pieces of a life he was preparing to leave behind, I realized I wasn't afraid of our age difference anymore. I was afraid of never getting the chance to tell him what had slowly become impossible to ignore. And suddenly, I knew I couldn't let him walk away without hearing the truth. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The garage was filled with sealed boxes, folded furniture covers, and years of memories waiting to be loaded onto a moving truck. Jimmy set the roll of packing tape on a nearby table. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. I looked around the garage before meeting his eyes again. "I almost didn't." He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "I figured you needed time." "I did. And I'm glad you took it." His calmness somehow made this even harder. Jimmy wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to convince me to stay. He had already accepted whatever happened next. "I don't want to make your life more complicated, Alex," he continued. "You're 24. You have your whole future ahead of you. You should be traveling, building your career, meeting people your own age. You deserve that." I shook my head. "Stop deciding what I deserve." He looked surprised. I stepped closer. "You told me how you felt. I never gave myself the chance to figure out how I felt." Jimmy remained silent. "I spent the last week trying to convince myself that I only missed my morning walks." I laughed softly. "Then I tried convincing myself I only missed our conversations." I looked directly into his eyes. But none of that was true. The garage became completely still. "I missed you." Jimmy's expression changed, but he still said nothing. "I'd wake up every morning expecting to see you. I'd order coffee and wonder what joke you would have made. I'd walk through the park hoping I'd accidentally run into you." I smiled to myself. "And when Mrs. Harper told me you were moving," I paused. "It felt like someone had taken away a future I didn't even know I wanted." Jimmy slowly lowered his head. "Alex." I took another step toward him. "I was never afraid of you. I was afraid of what people would think. Our age difference. The questions. The judgment. The whispers." Jimmy let out a slow breath. "I've lived through enough judgment for both of us." "I know." But then I realized something. I smiled. The happiest part of every single day wasn't my workout. It wasn't my job. It wasn't anything else. It was spending time with you. Jimmy's eyes became glassy. "I don't need perfect. I don't need people to understand. I just know that when I imagined you leaving Portland, it hurt." A tear rolled slowly down Jimmy's cheek. "I promised myself I wouldn't cry," he said with a nervous laugh. "Guess I failed. You don't have to pretend with me." He looked at me for a long moment. "Alex, are you sure?" I answered without hesitation. "No." He blinked in surprise. I smiled. "I'm not sure about what the future looks like. I'm not sure how easy this will be. I'm not sure what challenges we'll face. But I am sure about one thing. I don't want to lose you without finding out where this could lead." Jimmy closed his eyes for a second before smiling. "That's the most honest answer anyone has ever given me." He reached out carefully, giving me every chance to step back. Instead, I gently took his hand. His fingers trembled slightly. For the first time since we'd met, words weren't necessary. The silence said everything. A week later, the moving truck reservation was canceled. The boxes slowly disappeared back into the house. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. In many ways, it became more complicated. We decided not to rush anything. We continued our morning walks. We kept meeting for coffee. We spent evenings cooking dinner together, watching old movies, and talking for hours about everything from childhood memories to future dreams. Our relationship grew naturally not because either of us was trying to prove something, but because every day together felt right. A month later, Jimmy received an unexpected phone call. His son, Ethan, was coming home for a visit. "I should probably warn him," Jimmy admitted nervously. "You don't have to hide anything. I've hidden enough in my life." A few days later, Ethan arrived. He greeted his father with a long hug before noticing me standing in the kitchen. "You must be Alex," he said with a smile. "I've heard a lot about you." I laughed nervously. "I hope that's a good thing." "The best." Over dinner, the conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Ethan asked about my work, my photography, and how Jimmy and I had met during our morning walks. There were no awkward questions. No uncomfortable silence. After dinner, Ethan asked if we could step outside onto the porch. For a moment, I worried about what he might say. Instead, he smiled. I haven't seen my dad this happy in years. I looked toward the living room window where Jimmy was washing dishes while quietly humming to himself. He deserves to be happy. Ethan nodded. So do you. He placed a hand on my shoulder. Take care of him. I will. And let him take care of you too. Those words stayed with me long after he left. Seasons changed. Summer became autumn. The trees surrounding Washington Park turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Our morning walks never stopped. Neither did our coffee tradition. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we simply enjoyed the silence together. One crisp October morning, we stood overlooking the city as the sun slowly climbed above the mountains. Jimmy handed me my usual coffee. Still think they have the best espresso in Portland? I smiled. I've had better. He looked offended. You have. I nodded. The coffee isn't what makes this place special. What does? I looked at him. The company. Jimmy laughed, shaking his head. I was hoping you'd say the view. The view's pretty great too. He slipped his hand into mine as we continued walking. Down the quiet trail. People often asked what I saw in a man 31 years older than me. The truth was simple. I never fell in love with Jimmy because of his age. I fell in love with the man who listened when no one else did. The man who remembered the little things. The man who taught me that love isn't measured by birthdays, appearances, or the opinions of strangers. It's measured by how safe you feel when someone smiles at you across a quiet morning trail. Every sunrise still reminds me of the day we first met. What began as two neighbors sharing a simple good morning became the greatest chapter of my life. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories don't begin with fireworks. Sometimes they begin with an ordinary walk at sunrise. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life.